Welcome to the Lyceum Institute Colloquium series. These colloquia, comprising a pre-recorded lecture and live question and answer session, invite respected academics and intellectuals to challenge our thinking through their own hard-earned expertise and reflections. This lecture, the first of the series, is provided by Dr. Matthew Meinard. Dr. Meinard has been a friend of mine for some years now. We met at a conference and bonded over a shared admiration for the work and person of John Dee, as well as a love for rigorous understanding and defense of scholasticism. Dr. Meinard is an accomplished translator of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, but an insightful thinker and commentator in his own right as well. And so it is to these insights that we now turn our attention.
Hello and welcome to today's lecture. I'm Dr. Matthew Meinard, Professor of Philosophy and Moral Theology at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary of St. Cyril and Methodius in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The title of today's lecture is Defending and Meditating on First Principles, Wisdom, and Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Probably, I would presume, most listeners here at the Lyceum have some idea of whom Father Garrigou-Lagrange is, but just a few remarks biographically just to situate him a little bit. Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange was a long-term teacher at the Angelicum, the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, at the beginning of the 20th century, teaching there for about 50 years. He was born in 1877, and in his youth, after pursuing medical studies for a brief period of time, decided to take on the habit of the Order of Preachers, the Dominicans. He taught up until the late 1950s or early 1960s, and he died during the time of the Second Vatican Council. Presumably, from what I know from the biographical accounts, he had begun to lose his mental faculties quite significantly by that period of time. From what I've also read, secondhand reports, or maybe even really third-hand reports, he did so with great grace, having accepted the cross of his last years. His overall biography is massive, something like 700 entries. Now that's going to include brief articles, recapitulations, and things that then were bound together as collections. But he touched on many domains within Thomistic philosophy and theology, and our focus today will be really mostly within the domain of Thomistic philosophy, although we're going to see that his insights come from his work as a theologian. He's very well known for having written a number of works in spiritual theology, most often known for his 3 Ages of the Spiritual Life, which is a 2-volume series on the spiritual life. And this was the fruit of many decades of teaching a course in spiritual theology. However, throughout the whole period of his teaching at the Angelicum, he also taught a course on Aristotle's Metaphysics, effectively tracing along the lines of St. Thomas Aquinas' own commentary on the Metaphysics, though adding his own reflection based on the later positions held by the broader Thomistic school, which had crystallized around a number of commentators, of whom you may or may not be aware. People like Thomas de Vio-Cajetan, who commented during the Renaissance period on the Summa Theologiae, as well as Francesco Silvestri, or Sylvester of Ferrara, who commented on the Summa Contra Gentiles, and even more so, a Baroque figure like John of St. Thomas or Jean Poinsot, very dear to the founder of the Lyceum because of the work of John Dee, and in particular 17th century theologians like Charles-René Billoir and also Jean-Baptiste Gonnet. The point is, he was part of the Thomist school, and he reflected on metaphysics and other problems in light of what the later school had to teach about this or that topic in theology, which had ramifications for philosophy. But he taught still effectively a course in directly Aristotelian metaphysics in that Thomistic light, and he did this throughout all of his career. Based on accounts of people who were his students, he spent a great deal of time teaching the 4th book of the Metaphysics. In this section of Aristotle's work, the ancient philosopher defends, primarily at least his concern is with defending the so-called principle of non-contradiction, that one and the same thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. To Father Garrigou-Lagrange's eyes, this functions as really the first principle, the most certain principle, and it's pretty clear that Aristotle holds this as well in the text, that has to illuminate everything else that one does in metaphysics. It's based upon the appropriately abstracted notion of being, rendered intelligible not merely in terms of material being, but indifferently either material or immaterial, and it illuminates the entire domain of what one might call, ahistorically of course, ontology, or the study of being. There are dangers to using that language because it's not actually even scholastic verbiage, but the idea holds that the principle of non-contradiction functions as a light illuminating all the other disquisitions that one takes up in metaphysics. Well, anyway, the point for right now is just the fact that he gave such importance to this fourth book, and it stood out to his students. And when I read about this fact, I wasn't surprised, because this is a topic that Father Garrigou-Lagrange drove home many, many times throughout his career. Along these lines, I'm reminded of just two passages I'd like to share that were based, in one case, on a review written about one of his former students, and in another case, about his teacher, Father Ambrose Gardet. In the 1940s, Father Emmanuel Duranzo, who was one of Father Garrigou-Lagrange's students, began really the monumental work that he did on sacramental theology. He taught for many years at the Catholic University of America, and he eventually penned something like probably more like 6,000 or 7,000 pages worth of sacramental theology textbooks. But they were very well informed by everything that had been debated really in ecclesiastical history down through his day, very lengthy texts. And in a review that Father Garrigou-Lagrange wrote on a couple of the texts altogether, he did sort of a combined review, he makes a remark that really, it echoes things that he says all the time throughout his career. He says, these texts written by Father Duranzo don't suffer from the defect that we seem to see in a lot of other texts, which are more preoccupied with conclusions than with principles. He gives his primary attention in his analysis to considerations of the principles of theology and a metaphysical analysis, he says, or we could just say a conceptual analysis of the notions that are involved in them. So I'm just giving a rough translation here on the fly. But the idea was that Father Duranzo's text was primarily concerned not with all the various conclusions that the different schools of theology had reached over the years, but rather was with laying out the principles within sacramental theology. But then also, too, even more strikingly, is a text that was written after Father Ambrose Gardet passed away. Father Gardet was one of Father Garrigou's teachers, as well as a collaborator at distance, we could say, throughout their lives. And so he wrote, in memory of his teacher, Father Gardet was one of those people who believe that the living explanation of St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae consists, above all, in emphasizing the great principles that illuminate everything and in drawing attention to the loftiest summits in this mountain range, that is, to roughly 50 articles that provide the keys to the entire work. He passed upwards from conclusions to principles more than he descended from principles to conclusions. Listening to some of his courses, one indeed understood why it is commonly said that St. Thomas learned more in prayer than in study, not perhaps that he would have grasped new conclusions, but because it is in prayer that the soul is lifted up to contemplation of the superior principles that have been often cited, but whose elevation and radiance had not yet been seen well enough or clearly enough. One then perceives in an instant, in a flash, that they virtually contain entire treatises, and in this way the unification of knowledge is brought about, something that is far more precious than the material multiplicity of conclusions. Today's lecture is based on an insight I ran into, well informed by the line of thought coming out of Father Garrigou, but actually by accidentally stumbling upon a text by Jacques Maritain whenever he was writing in defense of certain positions he took regarding the nature of theology. He was responding to Father Santiago Ramirez, a great commentator on Aquinas, a Spanish commentator whose work deserves far more awareness in the English-speaking world than it has received heretofore. And there was a remark where Father Ramirez referred to theological conclusions. Now, excuse me for leaning a little bit into the domain of theology for doing this philosophy, but it's important to understand, I think, on their own terms, how figures in the Thomist school came to their insights, even though, as you'll see very briefly, they basically buttress the insights that Aristotle himself, and one could even say Plato, in the famous divided line, had already seen. But in Aristotle, it's very clear, even though the point seems to often be overlooked. So it became very normal to discuss, I think it even goes back into the 14th century, or 15th century debates over the nature of theology, to talk about theology as the theological science. And also, too, to speak of metaphysics as a kind of wisdom in the Aristotelian sense of wisdom, which we'll discuss in a minute in more detail, as though metaphysics were the highest of sciences. There are texts, not only in Thomas Aquinas, but in Aristotle and in other Aristotelians, that could lead one to think that the warp and woof of science is really the same as that of wisdom, that epistêmê and sophia are the same. Aristotle's posterior analytics is devoted to the structure that is necessary for scientific discourse. How does one reach first principles, the often forgotten second book that people don't tend to talk about as much? How do you define good middle terms for scientific demonstration? And then how do you draw appropriate conclusions in light of those first known principles? And there are many different sciences, and they have many different principles. And it's not as though one finds one first principle and then deduces multiple other principles. Instead, one can find within any domain of knowledge a number of first principles, and it's in light of those principles that one draws one's conclusions. But the overall, we could say, gaze of the person doing science, the person thinking in an epistêmê way, is toward the conclusions that are drawn in that discipline. Scientific conclusions would be the primary, you could say, coloration of knowledge that is known in any of the quote-unquote sciences. In Aristotle, it seems that at times natural philosophy plays the role of science, mathematics as well, and then metaphysics is a form of wisdom. Metaphysics is an all-embracing domain, and it has to defend its principles in a different way. But it's not always clear how it is that differs from what a science does when it defends its principles, because that has to be done as well, and it's quite clear that it occurs whenever one reads the beginning of the Physics, for instance, by Aristotle. So, there was a remark that Maritain made about theological conclusions and also theological knowledge, where he remarks about the nature of certain premises, and he refers to them in terms of being theologically known things, and he doesn't say that they're theological conclusions. Father Ramirez misses this fact, and so Maritain has to write a response, and he says, well, listen, there are more than conclusions that theology is concerned with. Theology reflects upon its principles. Theology defends and also shows the richness of the principles of faith upon which it is based. And this is actually its noblest task. That it's not merely a matter for theology of taking over something from faith and just sort of blindly going forward in the march of drawing conclusions, but instead is a true attempt at achieving the intellectus fidei, some understanding, discursively, concerning the mysteries of faith. In the end, it's the old Anselmian line of faith-seeking understanding. But there's a unique way to consider the very principles of theology, because when theology or theological reflection takes them over, the theologian is concerned with matters of faith in a very different way than the mere believer. Well, I happen to notice that the English translation actually in the current form that it's in, makes a mistake here. And I'm pretty generous to translators because it's a miserable and difficult business. But in this case, the word savoir, or knowledge, at least for the purposes of that sentence, are translated in all cases as science, theological science. There is a temptation to collapse into each other the notion of knowledge and also wisdom directly into science, because everyone would talk about theological conclusions and theological science. And theology would be said by Thomists to be the highest of sciences because it's concerned with the highest of causes, and hence its wisdom. All of this is based upon dicta found in Aquinas that are quite clear, but it's also obvious in Maritain remarks, as well as in texts by Garrigou, who himself waffles terminologically here because he uses some of the older terminology as well. But in Garrigou's own texts, that wisdom has a particular manner of reasoning that must be seen as really superadded in the end to that which is undertaken in epistêmê, or science. In the hoary world of scholastic terminology, the primary concern of scientific knowledge is objective inference, or objective illation, the drawing of new conclusions in light of premises through a middle term that is adequate to scientific deduction. However, one doesn't defend a principle. We've seen this from the time of Plato onward in the line that goes down through Aristotle. Principles are not defended directly. You don't have some first principle that you then just keep drawing conclusions about other principles from. You never can defend a first principle. You can only in some way show how that it's fitting, or usually in the domain of naturally acquired knowledge, you show the ridiculous consequences of not holding it, a reduction to absurdity argument. And this is clearly what Aristotle does in the fourth book of the Metaphysics, which has a whole series of these sorts of deductions to absurdity, or reductions to absurdity, concerning the principle of non-contradiction. But what's important to see is when you reduce something to such absurdity, you don't directly prove it. And so you're not drawing a new conclusion and coming to new knowledge, but you're instead showing externally why something should be held. And this is not nothing. And indeed, it's the only option that you have for such defense. But it's for this reason that later scholastic logicians would separate or distinguish objective inference or objective illation from these kinds of extrinsic arguments. So the temptation, I think, and I have some work that I would be glad to talk about in our session together, the temptation is, I believe, for most Aristotelians and Thomists, to treat the overall, we could say, gate of science and wisdom as being the same. And yet it's clear, I think, whenever we consider even Aristotle's own basic insights, that science is directed primarily toward conclusions and wisdom toward principles. That the more important thing for the person in a sapiential discourse is to see how it is that the conclusions are contained, but much more loftily, in the principles of that discourse. Whereas science is concerned with showing, in the end, that conclusions are certain, and it's in the refracted light of that conclusion certitude that you continue to appreciate what the principles are. To this end, I think that a remark that was made by a Benedictine who wrote a dissertation at the Midwest Studium, actually where John Deely would have done his studies as well, summarizes this perfectly. He makes in passing Father Kieran Conley, an Irish name from a different era. He makes a passing remark in a text that then was published as The Theology of Wisdom that summarizes this just absolutely clearly. And I think it should carry forward many discussions on these matters. He says, while science is interested in principles only insofar as they are related to its conclusions, and so you do have a real defense of principles, for instance, in the Physics of Aristotle. Let's put a pin in that for a second. Wisdom not only considers conclusions in the light of principles, it also judges the principles themselves, evaluating and defending their content. Now, it's along these lines that I believe, because I take a line very much along that of Maritain, Simone, and people like Jack Cahalan today, as well as John Deely, although his vocabulary is slightly different, that natural philosophy is actually a form of wisdom as well. It's actually the connatural wisdom. The physics is the connatural wisdom to our intellect in the current state, because we know things first as abstracted from their materiality and motion, first and foremost. And then that the contemporary sciences are forms of science in the most strict sense along these lines. But that's a seed to plant for many arguments among Thomists. But so, the issue that I have here, and I know that this is a long preamble to really what will be then just a direct example from Garrigou, because all of this is dependent, actually, upon him, especially down the line in Maritain, is that the offices of wisdom and the offices of science are quite different for an Aristotelian. And this begets different duties that have to be fulfilled in those disciplines themselves. And you see this laid out in great detail in Father Duranzo's own work on theology, where he talks about all the different things that must be done by theology because it's a form of wisdom. And it's also reflected in a text that deserves great attention for the philosopher De Revelatione, which, although is a theological explication of what apologetics is, contains much philosophy that's used and deployed by Father Garrigou. Father Garrigou's primary philosophical texts, to make that point before we go into the laying out of some first principles in metaphysics, can be found, I think, most profoundly in De Revelatione, which is to be published by Emmaus Academic here in the next year and a half or so, next year, hopefully. And also, though, his work, God, his existence and his nature, that even though it's got some really dated discussions, particularly with regard to agnosticism and things of that sort, there's a lot of philosophy that's in there. He also has his texts, The Sense of Mystery, at least half of that, which contains philosophy, as well as The Realism of the Principle of Finality, which is to be published in September, as well as Sens Commun, which was a response in part to people who denied proofs of the existence of God, and also to a response to the modernist crisis at the beginning of the 20th century. And that hopefully is going to be published sometime by the end of this year. These works have been in the pipeline at Emmaus Academic Press for a while. But whenever you read texts like those, you'll see in a much clearer and stark way the philosophical mind of Garrigou at work. Some of this is also reflected in the philosophical sections of Reality. Now, I'm going to be giving a synthesis that also elevates Garrigou past himself, because he still uses language that really slurs together wisdom and science at times. And yet it seems so clear, based on other comments that he makes, that the most primordial duty that falls the person who is in a discourse of wisdom, a sapiential discourse, as we'll refer to it from now on, is to meditate on the definitions of one's terms, which actually is a quite rich historical enterprise, to be honest, as well as, above all, the defense then of the principles that underlie the entire discourse. And these are defended both by showing their fittingness, by showing that they're not contradictory, and also, too, showing how principles are related to each other. He got into some arguments in the 19-teens, mostly then, and into the 20s, concerning how it is that the first principles of metaphysics are related to each other. Certain people thought that he held that they're deduced, that you first prove the principle of non-contradiction, and then you prove other principles. But no, he lays out quite clearly, especially in later editions of Sens Commun, as well as the later editions of De Revelatione, that it's a question of showing how you have an interdependence of principles, but you don't deduce them from one another. But sometimes the denial of a lower principle implies the denial of a higher one. So to use an example from theology, because it ends up being clearer, the two primary principles of Catholic theology, one could say, and of Orthodox theology as well, would be that of the revealed mystery of the Trinity and the revealed mystery of the Incarnation. One does not deduce the revealed mystery of the Incarnation from that of the Trinity, but the denial of the Incarnation is going to imply issues regarding then one's assent regarding the Trinity as well, possibly. Now, it falls to the theologian to lay that out, but it's an example of how you have revealed principles that do not immediately get deduced from each other, but you need to have a hierarchy that shows actually how it is that the incarnation is dependent upon the Trinity, and then one can go down into the incarnation, into ecclesiology, etc., and show once again how all of these various truths of faith are dependent, but not just immediately deduced from each other. But this also holds for metaphysics. People who are pure historians, though, will fault me for cleaning up these insights, because clearly the schools of Aristotelianism, as well as then the general line of the Thomist school, don't talk exactly in the language that I use here. And yet it's clear that in certain great exponents of the tradition, which I could lay out even in more length, make this same distinction. And I think that it's in seed in Aristotle himself. If you look at Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, the famous section where he lays out the various kinds of mental abilities and habitus, or hexes, there he lays out the basic capacities of human knowing, between practical and speculative intellection, the insight into principles, the difference between art and prudence, science and wisdom. And he does all of this so that he can get to the point of talking about the virtue of prudence eventually. But in Book 6, Chapter 7, he lays out what he has to say about wisdom, and there's an important passage right around 1141a15, for those of you who follow along in the Becker numbers. It says, "Therefore wisdom," and this comes from Ross's translation, "therefore wisdom must plainly be the most finished of the forms of knowledge. It follows that the wise man," and here is the important line, must not only know what follows from the first principles, science, but must also possess truth about the first principles. Therefore, wisdom must be comprehension, or what we would call intellectus in the scholastic tradition, insight into first principles, combined with knowledge, or science as we would call it. Knowledge of the highest objects which has received, as it were, its proper completion. This is a very important point that's made just, here in passing, and he moves on. And Thomas de Vio Cajetan sees it, even if he doesn't draw all the marrow out from it, in a remark made by Aquinas himself, that really is the entire light for this. That science contains understanding because it has to know first principles in its conclusions, and then wisdom has to contain science and understanding while it does something even higher than that. In the technical terminology of the school, wisdom is formally and eminently what science is. It's something greater than what science is, but indeed is science in a true sense. I would recommend to those who want to really read along these lines for what I think is actually the best, piercing insight as to why this is important, a work that I only ran across in the past year that someone recommended to me, Francisco Munoz's The Work of Theology, which was published by the Dominican Studium in D.C. It was translated from a Latin text of his. It's a great text that actually lays out why this is so important. The ratio, the formal notion of what wisdom is, contains what science is, but in a loftier way. And I think that this is so important for then understanding the nature of wisdom, or of metaphysics, of theology, of natural philosophy, of moral philosophy, etc. It's very important. But it also can explain why then someone like Father Garrigou-Lagrange could have a monomania. I have done a lot of translating work by Father Garrigou's works, and at times he can almost become vexing. He's repeating things all the time. A young Yves Simon was vexed about this. Now, Garrigou didn't have a secretary and worked in Rome, so part of the shortcomings of his prose are just that. He didn't have a great host of research assistants regularly, it seems. Although I would presume later in his career he probably did, but that's not our issue here today. But even so, you read him and you think, why is he just driving home some of these basic things over and over and over again? And is it just because he's got a kind of childish mind, which is what certain Jesuit thinkers, whose names I won't name, said about him? Or was it that he had an insight that the primary office that he had to fulfill was that of the wise man, or at least trying to be the wise man, the person teaching wisdom, that he didn't want to get lost in conclusions. He wanted to have the first principles as the primary concern. He actually even makes a remark about how in his youth that he realized that he was getting concerned with all of the various conclusions reached by the Thomist school, and was turning away from attention to principles. And it was a really important thing for him to realize the wrongness in that. In his various works, be they theological or metaphysical or philosophical, you can find him having these moments where he steps back and looks at first principles in order to lay them out for the sake of illuminating everything that's discussed. I can only think of, there's a chart that's wonderful that lays out the interrelationship between the various mysteries of faith that captures all in one schema what's necessary for understanding, kind of the whole of theology under the radiation of just these basic principles. Or he has a theological text on the Mother of God, on Mary, where he spends an entire chapter or two at the beginning just talking about the principle of what the divine maternity is, precisely because it functions as a kind of first principle in Mariology for understanding everything else that he discusses in there. But here at the Lyceum, we're concerned with matters philosophical, and although I could draw on sens commune, I actually think there's an excellent little summary in De Revelatione where he talks about first principles in metaphysics and how they're related to each other. And I just want to lay that out quite briefly. But I think it's so important because this is something that gets lost if one is only a textualist in reading Aristotle. Because if you were to read the fourth book of the Metaphysics, you're going to focus on the principle of non-contradiction. But there are other principles that are first in the order of metaphysical knowledge. That there are certain things that follow on the nature of being as being, that as soon as you grasp what that is, you'll see all the others. Or you'll see them quickly if you just reflect on the principles that just flow from the very first grasp of what being is. Now, Maritain's preface to Metaphysics actually does something quite similar to this, and it does so with a bit more blood, in the sense that his prose is less scholastic. So you may well want to read that as well. There's also a little volume by Gilson that may be of interest as well. Gilson sometimes gets under my skin because the Gilsonians wrote off so much of the other Thomists who weren't historical Thomists, but I'm not going to dig that grave again for that argument. That's something that bothered John Deely all of his life. But in any case, the way that Father Garrigou looks at metaphysics is, we could say, with the glance of an ontologist. Now, I use that term in a very loose sense, and it's also ahistorically used, but he looks at it primarily as a science of extramental being, of being as it exists separate from the apprehending intellect. I'm not going to go into why I think that's important, though I will open that up for discussion. You need to make some distinctions there that I think open up metaphysics beyond that, without it all turning its back on the insights, however, that the line coming out of Aristotle and the Thomist school as a whole give us. But there's a temptation to fall into Suaresianism in that regard, that I think really can be deleterious to future developments in metaphysics. But that's not our issue. He notes here in De Revelatione, it's around page 236 of the Latin edition, 236, 237, and there's a surrounding section, that there are, among other principles in metaphysics, a couple of these are wonky, mind you, but the rest of them are pretty well known, and they've got solid metaphysical basis in Aristotle, and they all do, really. There are the principle of contradiction, or the principle of non-contradiction, as I'll call it. The principle of identity, what he calls the principle of substance, the principle of raison d'etre, or ratio essendi. Sometimes this is translated as the principle of sufficient reason, but it's not at all what he gets at. He actually says that he's not using this in the same sense as the principle of sufficient reason. There's the principle of efficient causality, the principle of finality, and the principle of change. Let's just consider very briefly how each of these, and they're given to you here in a kind of descending order, how these illuminate so much of metaphysics. Metaphysics, for the Aristotelian, is the study of being qua being inasmuch as it is being, the laws of being, we might say, or the properties of being. And the most primary insight is that one and the same thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. Or, if we take all of that attendant verbiage and funnel it down into a single and very simple statement, being is not non-being. And as long as you remember its broader sense, this is not just a tautology, but for instance, one can say that being in act is not being in potency. That something that is potentially, we'll say, potentially a metaphysician, every human is potentially a metaphysician, the fact that you are potentially a metaphysician does not mean, however, that you actually are. There is a way to negotiate the senses of being that are involved there, precisely because of the principle of non-contradiction. If I might also tip my hat in John Deely's direction, even if it is away from Father Garrigou, this is the way that you can say that a given moral entity is different than a mere physical entity. And so you could say that, on the one hand, the flowers on the table are just flowers, physically there, cut out, but they're also a sign of the love of a spouse for his wife. But there are different properties that accrue to those flowers, whether we're talking about the being of moral existence or the being of physical or mind-independent existence. And the principle of non-contradiction can help us illuminate the way that those properties adhere to it. The principle of identity is just the flip side of the principle of non-contradiction. The first thing we grasp from our perspective is the fact that being and non-being are not the same. However, in itself, we see the implied principle that's there is the fact that being is being and non-being is non-being. That beings have their identity. And we don't really deduce that from the principle of non-contradiction. But if we were to reject it, we would have a heck of a time defending the principle of non-contradiction. But it's just a matter of saying there are things that have a certain essential characteristic and they have other non-essential characteristics, but they are what they are. And you just see that. Either you see it or you don't. That's actually how Aristotle argues to the principle of non-contradiction, although the principle of identity is mixed in Book 4 of the Metaphysics. Because in that text, he distinguishes between the per se, or the essential, and the accidental, or the per accidens. That's really how he goes forward in arguing for the principle of non-contradiction. The next principle Father Garrigou lays out is the principle of substance. Now, this is one that I find wonky, but everything which is a substance. Okay, so let's stick ourselves into a very hard ontologist mindset. Everything that exists has its primary substrate as a substance. That's what this is getting at. Now, you could also say everything that has existence of any sort whatsoever has an essential character. And that's sort of like saying that it's a substance, that it has something substantially always the same, but then things that are different, which would be accidental to it. Here, his concern is I think, tied up with so many of the realism debates, because he wants to distinguish between that which is phenomenal and only appears, as opposed to that which is substantial. We could take or leave this point. I've always found it a little bit odd. But then he has the principle of raison d'etre, which is very important, actually, because it's presupposed by other principles. We could say the principle for the reason for the existence of something. That every being has a raison d'etre, it has a reason for its existence, either in itself or in something else. Leibniz famously would cast this as the principle of sufficient reason, that everything has a sufficient reason within itself or in something else. But instead, the principle of the reason for the existence of something, or of raison d'etre, or of ratio essendi, is concerned with saying that either something is the reason for its own being, and that really only applies in the strongest sense to God, because he has aseity, he comes from himself, he's not even caused, right? But he is the reason for the very reason for his own existence. Or something has its causal dependence upon something else, that something depends either in the order of efficient causality or final causality upon some other thing in order for it to exist. You could even say that the same thing holds, I think, in the line of material causality, because every form-matter complex does indeed require its substrate, although that's a little bit dicey. Now, we could also use this, the principle of raison d'etre, for showing how it is that, for instance, let's just go back to those flowers. The flowers depend for their existence as a gift, as a moral entity, upon the choice and command that were elicited by the person who made them be a gift. This is called extrinsic formal causality. The physical flowers depend upon the free choice and command of the person who gives them precisely in order for them to exist as moral entities. And this is illuminated for us by the principle of raison d'etre. And because you have negotiations within there of different ways that being and non-being interact, whenever you deny the principle of raison d'etre, you're going to find it very difficult to defend the principle of non-contradiction. But this is not deduced from the principle of non-contradiction. And you could show and meditate on all the various different ways that this principle is operative in reality. Yes, it's operative in the kind of ontology sense, in which things are dependent upon their forms and upon their ends and upon the efficient cause that gives them existence. But also, too, the entire domain of culture unfolds before you as being in part explained by this principle. Not explained in a rationalistic way, but explained in the sense that you at least get a glance of how it is that its laws of being are constituted. And I'm using the word laws of being in a loose sense, of course. The principle of efficient causality is in many ways just an application of the principle of raison d'etre. It is that every contingent being is efficiently caused by another. It's really just a concretization of the principle of raison d'etre. But it draws your attention primarily to the notion of contingent being and caused by another. Those two notions, they immediately join in that proposition. That as soon as you understand what a contingent being is, like if you mean the word contingent being, you have to see that it includes also then the property of being efficiently caused by another. That's just an immediate insight. That's the nature of intellectus. And then the metaphysician will defend that claim. And the same goes for the principle of finality. Father Garrigou wrote an entire book on this because he felt the need to defend its importance in metaphysics. If the final cause, the end, is the most important of all the causes, well, one would think that it would get the most reflection by the metaphysician, or a lot of reflection, we should say, by the metaphysician, that every agent acts on account of an end. If you understand what it is to be an agent, which is a being that does something, the somethingness of what it does is what the end is. This is a per se nota, an immediately seen principle, but it's not exactly deduced from any of the others. And then the principle of change brings in the material causality line, actually, that every change presupposes a changeable subject. That in order to speak of change, change is the change of something. It's not merely just change that is happening without any subject whatsoever. The only way that the latter case would even be possible would be a kind of pantheism that is ever-changing. So based on just these brief reflections on these principles, and then the more thematic question of how it is that they are defended, we can see that from an Aristotelian perspective, it's fair to say that there are two different domains of discursive knowledge, one called science or epistêmê, and one sophia, sapientia, wisdom. Epistêmê is concerned above all with the drawing of per se conclusions in light of first principles. But such knowledge is concerned with its principles in a way whose attention is bent toward the conclusions themselves that are illuminated by the principles. That science is in the end conclusion-directed knowledge. By contrast, wisdom, sophia, sapientia, it takes up a loftier task still, the defense and meditation upon these principles. I've tried today to show, yes, in Father Garrigou, but in the tradition surrounding him, how it is that this is an important and central task for articulating the noetics of human knowledge, for articulating the unique character of wisdom as a particular manner of knowing. There's much more that one could say, and I hope that our discussion time together will help fill out some of those details. But I thank you for the time listening to this lecture, and I hope that it has been edifying, and I look forward to the time we will be able to spend together in question and answer.